Everything you know about this myth is wrong. The kidnapping that became a romance. The victim who became a queen. The love story that began with screaming. For 3,000 years, we've been told that Persephone and Hades represent the ultimate dark romance. The beauty who tamed the beast, the spring maiden who fell for the Lord of Death. Modern retellings paint them as star-crossed lovers, as partners who chose each other despite the odds, as a couple whose love conquered even death itself. But the ancient Greeks told a completely different story, and what they actually wrote is far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more revelatory than any modern romance could capture. She didn't fall in love with Hades. She was dragged into the underworld screaming, begging for help that never came. Her own father orchestrated the abduction. The god who would become her husband tricked her into eating seeds that bound her to his realm forever. And the compromise that saved her actually ensured she would never be free, never be whole, never be simply herself again. This was not romance. This was violation, transformation, and the birth of winter itself. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Persephone didn't just survive her abduction, she transformed it. The terrified maiden became Dread Persephone, one of the most feared deities in the entire Greek pantheon. The girl who knew only flowers became the queen who commanded the Furies, who judged the souls of the dead, who wielded power over life and death itself. She was victimized, yes, but she was not defeated. And that transformation, that claiming of power from powerlessness, that journey from Kor, the maiden, to Persephone, the queen, is the real story the ancient Greeks were telling. Tonight, we're going to strip away centuries of romanticization and examine what the ancient sources actually say. We'll discover how 6 pomegranate seeds created the seasons. We'll explore why Demeter's grief nearly destroyed all life on Earth. We'll investigate the secret rites of the Eleusinian mysteries that promised initiates eternal life. And we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most important myths are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that refuse to be simplified, the ones that contain violence and transformation and power and loss all tangled together in ways that resist easy interpretation. So let your breathing slow now. Allow the modern world, with its neat categories and comfortable narratives, to fade as we step back through the millennia. Back to a time when the changing seasons required divine explanation, when the boundary between life and death seemed more permeable than we imagine it today, when a mother's grief could starve the world, and when 6 small seeds could alter the course of existence itself. The myth of Persephone and Hades is one of the most misunderstood stories in all of Greek mythology. It has been retold countless times, adapted for new audiences, reshaped to fit changing values. But beneath all those retellings lies an ancient tale, far stranger and more powerful than most modern versions suggest. It is a story about abduction and agency, about grief that could end the world, about seeds that bind and cycles that must turn, about a girl who became a goddess not through choice but through survival, and about how even in the darkest realms, power can be claimed and identity forged anew. The story you think you know is just the surface. Beneath it lie layers of meaning that the ancient Greeks understood intimately, cycles of death and rebirth that governed their agricultural existence, mysteries so sacred that initiates were forbidden to speak of them on pain of death. Tonight we journey into those depths. We will follow Persephone's path from innocent maiden to dread queen, from victim to one of the most feared deities in the entire Greek pantheon. We will explore multiple versions of this ancient tale, from the earliest fragments in Hesiod to the elaborate Homeric hymn to Demeter, from Ovid's Roman perspective to the secret rites that promised a blessed afterlife. And perhaps, if we look carefully enough, we will discover something the ancient Greeks knew that we have forgotten. That the most profound transformations come not from choice but from necessity. That power can emerge from powerlessness. That spring and death are not opposites but partners in an eternal dance. And that some stories survive for 3,000 years, not despite their uncomfortable truths, but because of them. The Lord of the Underworld, Hades in shadow and stone. Before we can understand Persephone's story, we must first understand the god who would become her husband, the realm that would become her kingdom, and why the ancient Greeks feared to even speak his name. Hades was not the devil. He was not evil incarnate, not the villain of Greek mythology, despite how modern pop culture has cast him. He was something perhaps more unsettling in its ambiguity, a god of necessary darkness, of inescapable fate, of the silence that awaits us all. Hades was born into divine chaos, the eldest son of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, though he would paradoxically also be the last of his siblings to see the light of day. His father, terrified by a prophecy that foretold his own son would overthrow him, had taken to swallowing his children whole the moment they were born. Hades was the first to disappear down Cronus's throat, trapped in his father's belly alongside his sisters Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, and his brother Poseidon. They existed there in a strange, timeless suspension, neither truly alive nor dead, neither growing nor ceasing to exist, until their youngest brother Zeus came along. Zeus, hidden away by his mother Rhea and raised in secret on the island of Crete, eventually returned to confront his father. Through trickery or poison, depending on which ancient source you consult, Zeus forced Cronus to regurgitate his swallowed offspring in reverse order. Thus Hades, first consumed, emerged last, making him simultaneously the eldest and youngest of the Olympian generation. This paradox would define much of his existence. Always powerful yet peripheral, respected yet feared, included yet separate from the divine family that gathered on Mount Olympus. After the children of Cronus were freed, a war began that would reshape the cosmos. The Titanomachy, as this great conflict came to be known, pitted the young gods against their Titan parents and the old order they represented. The war raged for 10 years, devastating the earth and shaking the very foundations of existence. Victory came only when Zeus freed the Cyclopes from their imprisonment in Tartarus, and in gratitude, these ancient craftsmen forged weapons for the three brothers that would decide the war's outcome. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt, brilliant and terrible, able to split the sky and shake mountains. To Poseidon, they crafted the trident, capable of commanding the seas and causing earthquakes. And to Hades, they presented the helm of darkness, also called the cap of invisibility, a helmet that rendered its wearer utterly unseeable. This gift was perhaps the most fitting, for Hades would spend eternity as the unseen god, the one whose face mortals avoided, whose name they feared to speak, who existed in shadow and silence. When the Titans were finally defeated and cast into the depths of Tartarus, the three brothers drew lots to divide the cosmos among themselves. Zeus won the sky and became king of the gods, establishing his rule from Mount Olympus. Poseidon claimed the seas and all the waters of the earth, building his palace in the ocean depths. And Hades, whether by the drawing of lots or simply because no one else wanted it, received the Underworld, the vast realm of the dead that existed beneath the earth, beyond the reach of sunlight, where all mortal souls would eventually journey. The underworld that Hades ruled was not a place of punishment in the way later Christian concepts of hell would envision it. It was simply the realm of death, the place where all mortals went when their lives ended, regardless of virtue or vice. The ancient Greeks called it by many names: the House of Hades, Erebos for its darkness, the Halls of Hades, or simply Hades itself, as the god and his realm became nearly synonymous in the Greek imagination. To reach this realm, souls had to cross several boundaries. First came the river Styx, the river of hatred, which surrounded the underworld 9 times. A soul needed to pay Charon, the grim ferryman, a coin for passage across the waters. This is why ancient Greeks placed coins on the eyes or in the mouths of their dead, ensuring they could pay this essential toll. Those who could not pay were doomed to wander the shores of the Styx for 100 years before being allowed to cross. Once across the Styx, souls encountered Cerberus, the massive 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of the underworld. Cerberus allowed all souls to enter but permitted none to leave. Ancient descriptions painted him as terrifying. 3 heads that never slept all at once, a serpent's tail, and a mane of writhing snakes. Yet he was devoted to Hades, his master, and served his purpose without fail. The living feared Cerberus, but the dead had nothing to fear from him. His job was not to torment, but simply to maintain the boundary between the living and the dead. Beyond Cerberus lay the underworld proper, a vast realm of shadowy meadows and dark palaces. Here, the dead existed as shades, pale remnants of their former selves, lacking blood and strength, able to think but not fully feel, remembering their lives, but no longer truly living. Most souls went to the Asphodel Meadows, a plain of gray flowers and gray earth, where they would exist in peaceful but monotonous eternity, neither suffering nor particularly happy, simply continuing in a diminished form forever. But the underworld had other regions. The truly wicked, those who had offended the gods or committed terrible crimes, were sent to Tartarus, a prison deep beneath even the underworld itself, as far below Hades as earth is below the sky. Here, famous sinners like Tantalus, Sisyphus, and the Danaids suffered eternal punishments fitting their crimes. And for the truly virtuous, the great heroes and those whom the gods favored, there was Elysium, also called the Elysian Fields, or the Islands of the Blessed, a paradise where eternal spring reigned, where fruit grew year-round, and where the dead could spend eternity in peace and plenty. Hades himself resided in a great palace in the heart of his realm, seated on an ebony throne, holding a scepter or a bident, a two-pronged weapon similar to his brother's trident. Alongside him sat his queen, though for countless ages that throne remained empty. Hades ruled alone, administering justice to the dead with the help of three judges: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, all great kings during their mortal lives, now serving to determine where each soul should spend eternity. The ancient Greeks had an interesting relationship with Hades as a deity. They feared him intensely but did not necessarily hate him or consider him evil. He was simply implacable, inevitable, and final. His realm received all mortals eventually: kings and beggars, heroes and villains, beloved and despised. Death played no favorites, and neither did Death's king. He was described by Homer as pitiless in heart, but not cruel for cruelty's sake. He simply was what he was, the embodiment of death's finality, the keeper of boundaries that should not be crossed. Because of this fearsome reputation, the Greeks rarely spoke his name directly, preferring euphemisms. They called him Pluton, meaning the wealthy one, or the giver of wealth, recognizing that all riches come from beneath the earth, minerals and gems and fertile soil, all belonging to the realm below. The Romans would later adopt this name as Pluto, and it carried a more positive connotation than Hades itself. They also called him Polydegmon, or host of many, Idoneus, meaning the unseen one, and sometimes simply the other Zeus, or Zeus of the Underworld, acknowledging his power and his royal status, even as they distinguished him from his more celebrated brother. Very few temples were built to honor Hades. The Greeks were reluctant to attract his attention, fearing that worship might cause the god of death to notice them before their time. When they did sacrifice to him, they turned their faces away and used black animals, most commonly black sheep or cattle. These sacrifices were performed at night, in pits or trenches rather than on altars, with the blood poured into the earth to reach the realm below. Oaths sworn in Hades' name were considered the most binding and terrible, for his judgment was inescapable. The symbols associated with Hades reflected his dominion. The cypress tree, dark and often found in graveyards, was sacred to him. The white poplar was also his, said to grow along the river Acheron in the underworld. He was associated with the screech owl, a bird of ill omen. Keys symbolized his control over the gates of the underworld, eternally locked so that no soul could escape. His bident represented his power over the dead, parallel to Zeus's thunderbolt and Poseidon's trident, but suited to ruling the silent realm below. And there was one more symbol that would become forever linked to Hades, though he did not possess it at first: the pomegranate. That fruit, blood red and filled with countless seeds, would enter his mythology only when a queen came to share his throne. When the dark palace gained a goddess, when the god who had ruled alone for ages finally took a bride. But that bride did not come willingly. She did not descend to the underworld out of love or curiosity or choice. She was taken, stolen from the sunlit world above, and her abduction would shake the foundations of Olympus and nearly destroy all life on Earth. To understand why, we must leave the underworld for now and travel to the surface, to meadows filled with flowers, to a realm of eternal spring, where a young goddess danced with nymphs and knew nothing of darkness or death, or the god who watched her from below. The Maiden of Spring, Kor. Before the fall, in the time before her abduction, before she ever set foot in the underworld or tasted the pomegranate seeds that would bind her there, the goddess we know as Persephone was called by a different name. She was Kor, which simply means the maiden in ancient Greek, a title that spoke of innocence, of youth, of potential not yet realized. She was spring itself made divine, the embodiment of new growth and blossoming life, the promise of renewal that came each year after winter's darkness. Kor was the daughter of Zeus, king of the gods, and Demeter, the great goddess of agriculture, grain, and the harvest. This parentage was significant beyond mere divine genealogy. Zeus was the most powerful of all the gods, ruler of sky and storm, dispenser of justice, and head of the Olympian pantheon. But Demeter was no less important to mortal existence, for she controlled the fertility of the earth itself. Without her blessing, crops would not grow, seeds would not germinate, and humanity would starve. She was the difference between plenty and famine, between life and death, and her love for her daughter was as fierce and absolute as her power. The ancient sources tell us little about Kor's childhood or the years she spent with her mother. She was raised in Olympus, or perhaps on Earth itself, always under Demeter's watchful eye, always surrounded by beauty and abundance. She was a maiden goddess, virginal and pure in the way Greek culture understood those concepts, untouched by marriage or the complications of adult life. Her companions were the Oceanids, the nymph daughters of the Titan Oceanus, young like herself, forever dancing and playing in meadows, far from the concerns of gods and mortals. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, our most complete ancient source for her story, we are told that Kor was playing with the deep-bosomed daughters of Oceanus and gathering flowers over a soft meadow. Roses and crocuses and beautiful violets, irises also and hyacinths, and the narcissus. The image is one of perfect pastoral innocence, a young goddess delighting in the simple beauty of the natural world, picking flowers with her friends as maidens had done since time immemorial. There is no hint in this opening scene of the trauma that would soon shatter this peace. The flowers she gathered were not random. In Greek culture, flowers carried symbolic meaning, and the Homeric hymn specifically names them for a reason. Roses signified love and beauty. Crocuses were associated with youth and spring. Violets represented faithfulness and were sacred to both Demeter and Persephone herself. Irises, named after the rainbow goddess, bridged heaven and earth. Hyacinths spoke of tragic love and transformation, named after the beautiful youth whom Apollo accidentally killed and transformed into a flower. But it was the narcissus that would prove most significant, and the Homeric hymn tells us this flower was no accident of nature. It was specially created as a trap, a marvelous radiant bloom, grown as a lure for the bloom-faced girl by the will of Zeus. The earth itself, Gaia, grew this particular narcissus at Zeus's command to please Hades, described in the hymn as the host of many, using one of the euphemistic titles by which the Lord of the Dead was known. The narcissus in question was unlike any natural flower. The Homeric hymn describes it as having 100 blooms growing from a single root, its fragrance so powerful that the entire sky above and earth below smiled at its scent. Such a flower could not exist in nature. It was a thing of divine magic, a beautiful trap designed to separate Kor from her companions, to make her wander just far enough from the group that when the earth opened beneath her feet, no one would be close enough to help. This detail of Zeus creating the trap for his own daughter is crucial to understanding the myth. Hades did not act alone in abducting Persephone. The abduction was planned, orchestrated, approved at the highest level of divine power. Zeus himself, as Kor's father, gave permission for his brother to seize her. Different sources debate Demeter's knowledge of this arrangement. The Homeric hymn makes it clear that Demeter knew nothing of Zeus's plan, that the abduction was done behind her back. Demeter did not take part in this. But Zeus's complicity meant that when Demeter later demanded her daughter's return, she faced not just Hades, but the will of the king of the gods himself. Why would Zeus arrange such a thing? Why would a father conspire to have his daughter abducted by his own brother? The ancient sources offer few clear answers, leaving us to interpret based on cultural context. In ancient Greece, fathers held absolute authority over their daughters, including the right to arrange marriages without the daughter's consent. Women, even divine women, were not asked their preferences. They were given in marriage by their fathers or male guardians to men whom those guardians deemed suitable. From this cultural perspective, we might infer that Zeus saw himself as simply exercising his paternal right to arrange a politically advantageous marriage. Hades was powerful, wealthy in his control of the earth's mineral riches, and importantly, one of Zeus's own brothers, keeping power consolidated within the family. These considerations would have seemed reasonable to ancient Greek audiences, though they may trouble us today. That such an arrangement required trickery and force, that Hades needed to abduct Persephone rather than woo her, that neither Demeter nor Kor herself were consulted, the evidence suggests these elements would not have seemed as problematic to ancient audiences as they do to modern readers. The Homeric hymn, even while working within these cultural assumptions, nevertheless makes clear, through its language and emotional tone, that something terrible has occurred. The poem's choice of words is not the language of marriage arrangement, but of violent crime. On that fateful day, Kor saw the miraculous Narcissus and was drawn to it, wondering at its beauty. She reached out both hands to pluck the lovely bloom from the earth. But the moment she touched it, the ground beneath her feet split open. From that chasm in the earth emerged Hades on his golden chariot, drawn by immortal horses, ascending from his realm in darkness to the world of light for this single, terrible purpose. What happened next is described in unmistakable terms in every ancient source. Hades seized Korah violently. The Homeric hymn says, "He caught her up reluctant on his golden car and bare her away lamenting." The Greek word used is harpaxis, which carries connotations of seizing, snatching, plundering. There is no ambiguity here. Kor did not go willingly. She fought. She screamed. The hymn tells us, "Then she screamed aloud, calling upon her father, the son of Kronos, who is most high and excellent. But no one, either of the deathless gods or mortal men, heard her voice. Her cries echoed across the mountains and into the depths of the sea, but no one came to help her. The other nymphs, her companions, scattered in fear. Only Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads, heard the cries from her cave. And Helios, the sun god who sees all things, witnessed what had occurred, but neither intervened. Hecate did not come. Helios merely watched. And Zeus, who could have stopped his brother, was far away, receiving sacrifices in some distant temple, conveniently absent when his daughter was stolen. The earth closed over the chasm through which Hades had emerged, sealing Kor away from the sunlight, from the flowers, from her mother's protection, from everything she had known. She was carried down into the depths of the earth, into a realm of darkness and silence, into a palace where no flowers grew and no seasons changed, where the sun never reached and time moved differently. She went from a world of eternal spring to a world of eternal twilight, from a life of joy and freedom to captivity, as the bride of a god she had never chosen, never wanted, never even met. And above ground, Demeter had no idea what had happened to her daughter. She knew only that Kor had vanished, as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed her, which of course it had. But Demeter did not yet know this. She knew only that her daughter, her beloved child, the center of her existence, was gone. And with that knowledge, or rather that terrible absence of knowledge, began a grief so profound that it would nearly end all life on earth. A mother's grief, Demeter's search and the world's desolation. The moment Demeter realized her daughter was missing, something fundamental shifted in the cosmos. The goddess of agriculture, of fertility, of life-giving grain and harvest, felt a terror so complete that it stopped her divine heart. One moment, she had been secure in the knowledge that Kor was safe, playing with her nymph companions in a sunlit meadow. The next moment, she heard a scream that carried across the earth and sea. Her daughter's voice calling for help, and then terrible silence. Demeter rushed to the meadow where Kor had been picking flowers. She found the nymphs frightened and confused, unable to tell her what had happened, for they had scattered when the earth opened and had seen nothing of the actual abduction. The flowers Kor had been gathering lay scattered on the ground, already wilting. The miraculous Narcissus that had lured Kor away was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. There was no trace of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, no indication of where her daughter had gone. Kor had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. What followed was a search of such intensity and duration that it became legendary even among the gods. For 9 days and 9 nights, Demeter wandered the earth, never sleeping, never eating, never pausing in her desperate hunt for her missing child. The Homeric hymn tells us she held flaming torches in both hands, searching through the darkness, calling Kor's name in every valley and mountain, questioning every person and deity she encountered. Had anyone seen her daughter? Did anyone know where she had gone? But no one could or would tell her. The gods who knew remained silent. Zeus, who had orchestrated the whole affair, kept his distance, receiving sacrifices in temples far from Demeter's path. Hades, of course, was unreachable in his underworld realm, and the other Olympians, caught between Zeus's will and Demeter's grief, chose silence over involvement in what was clearly a family crisis of cosmic proportions. On the 10th day of searching, Demeter encountered Hecate, the goddess of magic, crossroads, and liminal spaces. Hecate had heard Kor's scream from her cave, but had not seen who had taken her. Together, the two goddesses went to Helios, the Titan god of the sun, whose all-seeing eye misses nothing that occurs beneath his light. Here at last, Demeter learned the truth. Helios told her that Hades, with Zeus's permission, had abducted Kor and taken her to be his bride in the underworld. He tried to soften the news, suggesting that Hades was not an unsuitable husband, that he was powerful and kingly, Zeus's own brother and thus Kor's uncle, and that Demeter should not be so distressed since her daughter would be queen of a vast realm. This was meant as consolation, the ancient equivalent of saying, "But he's from a good family," to excuse an arranged marriage. Demeter was not consoled. The Homeric hymn describes her reaction in stark terms. Then an even more terrible grief took hold of her, and in anger at the dark, clouded son of Kronos, she withdrew from the assembly of the gods and lofty Olympus. She abandoned her divine home, her throne, her responsibilities, everything that defined her role as an Olympian goddess. In her grief and rage, she disguised herself as an old woman and wandered the mortal world. Her wandering eventually brought her to Eleusis, a town in Attica northwest of Athens. Here, sitting by a well, where the daughters of King Celeus came to draw water, Demeter rested her weary body and broken spirit. The young women found this elderly stranger and, moved by pity, brought her to their mother queen Metaneira, who offered Demeter hospitality in the position of nurse to the infant prince Demophon. What happened at Eleusis would become central to one of the most important religious cults in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries. But in the context of Persephone's story, it serves as an interlude in Demeter's grief, a brief moment where the goddess tried to find meaning and purpose in her daughter's absence. She accepted the position as Demophon's nurse and, perhaps as a way of sublimating her maternal feelings, now that her own child was gone, she developed a plan to make the boy immortal. Each night Demeter would anoint Demophon with ambrosia and place him in the fire, slowly burning away his mortal nature, transforming him into a god. But one night, Queen Metaneira saw the nurse placing her baby in flames, and not understanding that this was a divine process, screamed in terror and snatched the child from the fire. Demeter, interrupted at a crucial moment in the transformation, was furious. She revealed her true identity as a goddess and declared that the boy would now remain mortal since his mother's interference had broken the spell. But before leaving Eleusis, Demeter gave the people there a gift. She taught them her sacred rites and mysteries, rituals that promised initiates a blessed afterlife, an understanding of the cycle of death and rebirth. She commanded them to build a great temple in her honor, and in that temple, she isolated herself, withdrawing not just from Olympus, but from her divine duties entirely. And it was here, in her grief-stricken seclusion at Eleusis, that Demeter enacted the most profound protest any deity had ever staged against the will of Zeus. She stopped doing her job. She refused to allow anything to grow. The Homeric hymn describes the consequences in devastating detail. Most terrible and cruel was the year she made for mortals upon the all-nourishing earth. The earth would not send up seed, for rich-crowned Demeter kept it hid. This was not petty revenge. This was existential crisis. Without Demeter's blessing, grain would not germinate, crops would not grow, orchards bore no fruit, vines produced no grapes. Oxen pulled plows in vain across barren fields. Farmers planted seed that rotted in the soil or simply lay dormant, refusing to sprout. The earth, usually so generous with its bounty, turned stubborn and sterile. Humanity faced starvation on a scale never seen before or since. The hymn tells us that Demeter would have utterly destroyed the mortal race with painful famine and would have deprived those who live on Olympus of the glorious honor of gifts and sacrifices had Zeus not intervened. This detail is crucial. The gods needed human worship and sacrifice to maintain their honor and importance. Without mortals to worship them, the gods' own power and status would diminish. Demeter's grief threatened not just human existence, but the entire divine order. Zeus tried to appease his sister through intermediaries, sending one god after another to Eleusis with promises and gifts. Iris, messenger of the gods, came with beautiful offerings. Demeter refused them all. One by one, every Olympian deity visited her, offering her any rights and honors she wished, if she would only relent and return to her duties. The Homeric hymn emphasizes this repeatedly, but no one was able to persuade her mind and will. So wroth was she in her heart, but she stubbornly rejected all their words. Demeter's demand was simple and absolute: return her daughter or watch the world end. She would not negotiate, would not compromise, would not accept any consolation prize or empty apology. Either Zeus brought Persephone back from the underworld, or humanity would perish, and with them, the worship and sacrifice that sustained the gods' honor and power. It was the only leverage a mother had against the king of the gods, and Demeter wielded it without mercy or hesitation. Finally, faced with the extinction of the human race and the collapse of divine worship, Zeus capitulated. He sent Hermes, messenger of the gods and guide of souls, down to the underworld with a command for Hades: release Persephone so that her mother might see her and cease her anger. But Zeus's command came with careful wording, loopholes that would make this apparent victory far more bitter than Demeter yet realized. The message Hermes carried was not a complete surrender. Zeus did not order Hades to release Persephone unconditionally. He ordered her release so that Demeter would cease from her dread anger with the immortals. It was a temporary measure to solve an immediate crisis, not a restoration of the status quo that had existed before the abduction. And Hades, receiving this message, understood exactly what Zeus intended. He had no intention of losing his queen permanently. Down in the dark halls of the underworld, where Persephone had spent months as the unwilling bride of Death's king, a confrontation was about to occur that would determine the fate of gods and mortals alike. 6 tiny seeds stood between Persephone and freedom, between winter and spring, between grief resolved and grief eternal. And whether through Hades' trickery, Persephone's hunger, or something more complex than either explanation allows, those seeds would be consumed, and with them, any hope of escape from the darkness would be devoured as well. The pomegranate seeds, binding fate through forbidden fruit. In the shadowed halls of Hades' palace, where no sun ever penetrated and time moved like honey, slow and heavy and inescapable, Persephone had endured months that felt like years. The ancient sources disagree on many details of her time in the underworld during this initial captivity, but they agree on one essential point. She did not go willingly. She did not accept her fate gracefully, and she refused every advance Hades made toward establishing their marriage as a genuine union. The Homeric hymn tells us that when Hermes arrived with Zeus's message, he found Persephone sorrowful and against her will, yearning for her mother. She was described as reluctant, unhappy, longing for the world above and the mother she had been torn from. This was not a bride settling into her new home. This was a captive. And every ancient source that describes this period emphasizes her distress and unwillingness. But Hades received Zeus's message, understood its implications, and knew he had very little time. If Persephone returned to Demeter, having eaten nothing in the underworld, she would be free to remain on Earth permanently. There was an ancient law, older than the Olympians themselves, older perhaps than the Titans who had ruled before them. Anyone who consumed food or drink in the realm of the dead became bound to that realm. To eat the food of the dead was to accept death's hospitality, to acknowledge death's dominion, to become part of that gray world forever. What happened next has been told and retold with variations that reveal much about how different eras and cultures understood consent, trickery, and agency. The oldest version we have, the Homeric hymn, says that Hades secretly gave her sweet pomegranate seed to eat, taking care for himself, that she might not remain continually with grave, dark-robed Demeter. The Greek word used is lathre, meaning secretly or stealthily. Hades tricked her. He concealed his intentions, gave her the seeds under false pretenses, ensured she would eat them without understanding the consequences. Later, when Demeter asked her daughter directly if she had eaten anything in the underworld, Persephone's answer in the Homeric hymn is revealing. "Mother, I will tell you all without error. When Hermes came, swift messenger from Father Zeus and the other sons of heaven, bidding me come back from Erebus, that you might see me with your eyes, and so cease from your anger and fearful wrath against the deathless gods, I sprang up at once for joy. But he secretly put in my mouth sweet food, a pomegranate seed, and forced me to taste against my will." The phrase "forced me to taste against my will" is crucial. Persephone explicitly states that she did not choose to eat the seeds, that Hades compelled her. Whether through physical force, through deception about what they were, through lies about their significance, or through some combination of these methods, the Homeric hymn makes clear that this was not a willing act. It was yet another violation, this time of Persephone's freedom to choose. Another way in which her agency was stripped away. Other ancient sources offer slightly different versions. Some later writers, perhaps uncomfortable with the image of Hades forcing food into Persephone's mouth, soften the story, suggesting she ate the seeds out of hunger after a long fast, or that she ate them absent-mindedly, not realizing their significance. Ovid's Roman version in the Metamorphoses suggests she plucked a pomegranate from a tree in the underworld gardens and ate 7 seeds rather than 6, making it seem more like a natural action rather than something forced upon her. But even in these softer retellings, the binding, Nature of the seeds remains constant, as does Hades's calculation in offering them. He knew what would happen. He understood the consequences even if Persephone did not, and he ensured, through whatever means, that she would consume them, knowing they would prevent her from leaving his realm permanently. The pomegranate itself is significant beyond its role in the plot. In ancient Greek culture, pomegranates were associated with fertility, marriage, and blood. The fruit's many seeds represented abundance and the potential for new life. Its deep red juice resembled blood and was sometimes used in fertility rites and wedding ceremonies. When a bride entered her new home in ancient Greece, she was sometimes given pomegranate to eat, symbolizing her new fertility and her integration into her husband's household. But pomegranates also had darker associations. Their abundance of seeds suggested death as well as life. The many souls in the underworld, the countless dead who outnumber the living. The red juice could symbolize the blood of death rather than the blood of life. The fruit had chthonic connections, links to the earth and the realm below. In choosing a pomegranate as the binding agent, the myth draws on all these associations: marriage, fertility, death, blood, abundance, and entrapment. The number of seeds varies in different tellings. The Homeric hymn does not specify a number, simply referring to a pomegranate seed in the singular, though whether this means one seed or seed, as a collective noun, is ambiguous in the Greek. Later sources settled on either 6 or 7 seeds, with 6 becoming the more common number, perhaps because it created a neat division. 6 months in the underworld with Hades, 6 months on earth with Demeter, half the year in darkness, half in light. When Persephone returned to her mother and Demeter learned what had happened, the goddess felt both joy at her daughter's return and horror at the implications of those consumed seeds. The Homeric hymn describes Demeter's immediate fear. But while Demeter was still holding her dear child in her arms, her heart suddenly misgave her for some snare, so that she feared greatly and ceased fondling her daughter and asked of her at once, "My child, tell me, surely you have not tasted any food while you were below? Speak out and hide nothing, but let us both know. For if you have not, you shall come back from loathly Hades and live with me and your father, the dark-clouded son of Kronos, and be honored by all the deathless gods. But if you have tasted food, you must go back again beneath the secret places of the earth, there to dwell a third part of the seasons every year. Yet for the 2 parts you shall be with me and the other Aeolipal gods." The division that Zeus decreed, based on the ancient law that Hades had invoked through the pomegranate seeds, was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but prevented total catastrophe. Persephone would spend 1/3 of each year, 4 months, in the underworld with Hades. The rest of the year, 8 months, she would remain on earth with Demeter and the other gods. Some sources suggest the division was half and half, 6 months each. But the Homeric hymn clearly states 1/3. This compromise had profound implications for both divine and human worlds. For Demeter, it meant that she would have her daughter back, but never completely. Every year, Persephone would have to return to the underworld, descending once more into darkness, and every year Demeter's grief would return with that departure. The goddess who had nearly destroyed humanity in her anguish now had her anguish regularized, made cyclical, transformed from an unbearable crisis into a bearable but recurring sorrow. For Persephone, the compromise was more complex. She would not be trapped in the underworld permanently, but neither would she be free of it. She was bound by those seeds, by that moment of consumption, whether forced or chosen, to return again and again to Hades' realm. She would be wife and queen of the dead for a third of every year, then daughter and maiden goddess for the remaining months. She would exist in two worlds, belong fully to neither, forever divided between light and shadow, spring and winter, life and death. For Hades, the compromise meant he would have his queen, but only part-time. For 4 months each year, his palace would have a mistress, his throne would be shared, his realm would have a goddess to balance the god. But for 8 months, he would rule alone again, his wife returned to the upper world, leaving him in the darkness and silence he had known for ages before her arrival. And for humanity, the compromise created the seasons. The ancient Greeks understood their world as having 3 main seasons, not 4 as we typically recognize today. When Persephone returned to Earth from the underworld, Demeter's joy manifested as spring and summer, times of growth and harvest, warmth and abundance. But when Persephone descended back into darkness, Demeter's grief returned, and with it came autumn and winter, times of cold and death, when crops would not grow and the earth turned barren once more. This etiological function, explaining why the seasons change, why winter comes, each year bringing death to the plant world, may have been the original purpose of the myth. But the story grew beyond this simple explanation to encompass themes of loss and reunion, violation and accommodation, power and powerlessness, transformation, and cyclical return. Persephone would make this journey every year for all eternity, descending and ascending, dying and being reborn, a goddess caught between 2 realms, belonging fully to neither, forever changed by 6 small seeds and what they represented. Yet something unexpected happened during those cycles of descent and return. Persephone, who had been taken to the underworld as a victim, as a maiden goddess stolen from her mother, as Kor the innocent girl, began to transform into something else entirely. The underworld changed her. Power, even power unwillingly obtained, even a throne claimed through violation, was still power. And Persephone, over time, would learn to wield it. Queen of the dead, Persephone's transformation and power. The Persephone who returned to the underworld for her second sojourn was not the same terrified maiden who had been dragged there against her will. Something had shifted during that first separation and reunion with Demeter. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she would return to the surface, that her captivity had limits. Perhaps it was the realization that even Zeus himself had been forced to compromise with Demeter's grief, suggesting that power took many forms, and mother's love was among the strongest. Perhaps it was simply that Persephone, having survived the worst that could happen to her, having endured abduction and captivity and loss, had learned something about herself that she hadn't known before. She was stronger than she appeared. The ancient sources that describe Persephone's later role as queen of the underworld paint a picture that is startlingly different from the weeping maiden of the abduction story. In Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, written earlier than the Homeric hymn and reflecting even more ancient traditions, Persephone appears as Dread Persephone, an epithet that speaks volumes about how she was perceived. She was not pitied. she was feared. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus travels to the edge of the world to consult with the dead prophet Tiresias, it is Persephone he must propitiate. Persephone who controls which souls may speak to him and which must remain silent. She is described as august Persephone and dread Persephone, titles denoting majesty and terror. Odysseus fears that she might send up the Gorgon's head, that awful monster, to drive him away if he lingers too long in the realm of the dead. This is a goddess with power, authority, and the will to use both. In the Iliad, we learn that Persephone commands the Erinyes, also known as the Furies, terrifying goddesses of vengeance who punish crimes, especially those involving family members. When someone swears a false oath or commits terrible crimes, it is Persephone who dispatches these agents of divine retribution to torment the guilty. She presides over justice in the underworld, determining punishments, maintaining order among the dead, ensuring that cosmic law is upheld even in the realm beyond life. Later Greek sources add to this picture of a powerful, even frightening goddess. Persephone is associated with ghosts and hauntings, with necromancy and communication with the dead. Witches and sorcerers invoke her name in their spells. She presides over the mysteries of death and what lies beyond it. Souls pray to her for mercy, for blessed rest, for some measure of peace in the gray eternity that awaits them. She alone, it seems, has the power to grant or deny such requests. How did this transformation occur? How did the abducted maiden become the dread queen? The ancient sources do not give us a clear narrative of this evolution. No single story that shows us Persephone actively claiming her power. However, scholars have interpreted the fragmentary evidence to suggest that Persephone adapted to her circumstances. Based on her later portrayal in sources like Homer's epics, it appears she survived not by fighting the underworld, but by understanding it, learning its rules, and eventually mastering them. She became what she needed to be to not just endure, but to rule. Consider what ruling the underworld actually entailed. As queen of the dead, Persephone would have vast responsibilities. All the souls arriving in the underworld, countless thousands every day, required judgment and placement. The three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, would decide each soul's fate, but they presumably reported to the king and queen, received their authority from Hades and Persephone. The enforcement of punishments in Tartarus, the maintenance of peace in the Asphodel meadows, the protection of the blessed souls in Elysium, all of this would fall under the royal purview. Persephone also inherited or developed dominion over certain aspects of the natural world connected to death and rebirth. She became associated with spring, not just because her return caused Demeter to make things grow, but because she herself embodied the principle of resurrection, of life emerging from death. Seeds that were planted, that died by being buried in earth, that spent months in darkness before sprouting, were under her protection. She was the bridge between death and rebirth, uniquely qualified for this role because she experienced both regularly, dying to the upper world when she descended and being reborn to it when she rose. The pomegranate, the fruit that had bound her to the underworld, became her sacred symbol. But in Persephone's hands, it transformed from a trap into an emblem of her power. The many seeds represented not just the souls in her domain, but also the potential for new life, the cycles of death and rebirth over which she presided. Blood red and sweet, the pomegranate spoke to the duality she embodied: death and life, darkness and spring, maiden and queen. Over time, different regions of Greece developed different cults and traditions surrounding Persephone. And in many of these, she was worshipped not as a victim, but as a powerful protector. In southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek colonists had established cities, Persephone was particularly revered. At Locri, in Magna Graecia, she was worshipped as a protector of marriage and a guardian of brides, an ironic role considering her own marriage's origins, but perhaps revealing how the Greeks understood transformation and adaptation. A woman who survived an abduction and became a queen was, in their view, exactly the goddess you would pray to for protection in your own marriage. Persephone's relationship with Hades also evolved beyond what the ancient sources explicitly state, though we must be careful about reading modern concepts of romance or love into these myths. The later sources suggest a degree of respect, even partnership, between the king and queen of the dead. Unlike Zeus, who had countless affairs, Hades was portrayed in most traditions as faithful to Persephone, though even this claim has exceptions in some more obscure myths. What we can say with certainty is that Persephone wielded power in the underworld. Decisions about souls, about justice, about mercy were made jointly by the divine couple, or sometimes by Persephone alone. She was not a decorative consort or a prisoner queen. She was an active ruler, and the dead feared and respected her accordingly. Dread Persephone was not a goddess to be trifled with, not a maiden to be patronized or dismissed. She had transformed from victim into sovereign, from Kore the girl into Persephone the queen. This transformation was not presented by the ancient Greeks as a happy ending or a justification for what had been done to her. The myth never suggests that the abduction was acceptable because Persephone eventually claimed power from it. Rather, it seems to acknowledge a hard truth about survival. Sometimes you must make the best of unbearable circumstances. Sometimes power can be found even in captivity. Sometimes transformation is forced upon you, but becomes your own nonetheless. Persephone's story, in its full complexity, presents a goddess who was violated and imprisoned, who suffered and grieved, but who also adapted and endured, and eventually ruled over a realm vast and terrible. She was not one thing or the other, not purely victim or purely queen, but both simultaneously, existing in contradiction, embodying the complexity that simple narratives cannot capture. And there was one more aspect of Persephone's transformation that made her story even more significant to the ancient Greeks, one that elevated her from mythological figure to religious mystery, from goddess of story to goddess of salvation. The secret rites performed at Eleusis, rites so sacred that initiates were forbidden to speak of them on pain of death, rites that promised those who participated a blessed afterlife and freedom from the fear of death itself. The Eleusinian mysteries, sacred secrets of death and rebirth. Of all the religious rites in ancient Greece, none was more revered, more influential, or more mysterious than the Eleusinian mysteries. These secret initiation ceremonies, held annually at Eleusis, from around 1600 BCE until they were suppressed by Christian Roman emperors in 392 CE, lasted nearly 2,000 years and drew initiates from across the Greek and Roman world. Emperors and slaves, philosophers and poets, men and women, free citizens and foreigners, all made the pilgrimage to Eleusis, seeking initiation. And all of them, despite the diversity of their backgrounds and experiences, maintained a vow of absolute silence about what they witnessed in the inner sanctum of Demeter's temple. The mysteries were based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, the abduction and return, the grief and reunion, the descent into darkness and ascent into light. But they transformed this myth from a story into an experience, from something you heard into something you lived, at least symbolically. The initiates didn't just learn about Persephone's journey. They reenacted it, felt it, underwent their own descent and rebirth within the ritual framework the goddesses had established. The mysteries consisted of two levels. The lesser mysteries, held in early spring at Agrai near Athens, were preparatory rites that purified candidates and made them eligible for the greater mysteries. These involved ritual cleansing, sacrifices, and instruction in the myths and protocols they would need to know. But the lesser mysteries were merely preparation. The true transformation occurred in the greater mysteries, celebrated each autumn at Eleusis itself. The greater mysteries lasted 9 days and followed a carefully structured progression. On the first day, initiates gathered in Athens, where priests proclaimed a sacred truce throughout all Greece, ensuring that those traveling to Eleusis could do so safely, regardless of any wars or conflicts that might be raging. This alone speaks to the importance placed on these rites, that even warring city-states would cease hostilities to allow safe passage for pilgrims. On the second day, initiates underwent ritual purification by bathing in the sea, washing away the pollution of everyday life and preparing their bodies for contact with the sacred. They also sacrificed piglets, which were associated with Demeter and the chthonic deities of the underworld. This sacrifice acknowledged that they would be entering a realm connected to death, asking permission and protection from the powers that governed such transitions. For the next few days, initiates fasted, abstaining from certain foods, particularly pomegranates and beans, which had sacred or chthonic associations. Some scholars suggest they may have fasted completely, experiencing physical hunger that mirrored Demeter's sorrow and Persephone's deprivation in the underworld. This fasting would also have heightened their susceptibility to the psychological and possibly chemical agents that would be employed during the actual initiation. On the 6th day came the great procession from Athens to Eleusis, a journey of about 14 miles along the sacred way. This was not a solemn march, but a festival, with thousands of initiates walking together, singing hymns to Demeter and Persephone, calling out to Iacchos, a deity associated with Dionysus who guided the procession, dancing and celebrating even as they moved toward the serious rites that awaited them. The procession deliberately took an entire day, with stops at sacred sites along the route, arrivals at dusk when the line between day and night, light and dark, was most liminal. The Homeric hymn to Demeter tells us that the procession passed through the Kerameikos, the cemetery district of Athens, a deliberate reminder of mortality, of the death that awaited all mortals, and that Persephone had experienced through her abduction. The initiates were retracing Demeter's journey, her search for her lost daughter, feeling something of her grief and desperation, even amid the festival atmosphere. Upon arriving at Eleusis after dark, the initiates entered the sanctuary complex, but did not immediately proceed to the inner temple. They spent the night in vigil, perhaps reenacting Demeter's all-night search for Persephone, keeping watch with torches, just as the goddess had done. At some point during this vigil, they were given a special drink called kykeon, the same beverage the Homeric hymn says Demeter accepted during her time at Eleusis. The kykeon recipe has been the subject of intense scholarly debate for centuries. The ancient sources tell us it was made from barley and pennyroyal, a type of mint, mixed with water. But many scholars believe it contained something else, something that would explain the profound psychological experiences initiates reported. The most popular theory suggests the kykeon was infused with ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains alkaloids similar to LSD, capable of producing powerful psychedelic experiences. Archaeological evidence lends some support to this theory. Ergot fragments have been found at sites associated with the Eleusinian cult, including in the dental calculus of a man buried at one such site, proving he had consumed ergot before death. Whether the kykeon contained enough ergot to produce hallucinogenic effects, or whether the psychoactive elements were simply rumor or later addition, remains uncertain. What is certain is that the initiates experienced something transformative, something that changed their understanding of death and what might lie beyond it. After drinking the kykeon and spending the night in vigil, the initiates finally entered the telesterion, the great hall of initiation, the inner sanctum where the most sacred rites would be performed. This was a massive structure, able to hold thousands of people, with a central chamber called the anakteron, where the high priest and priestess performed the secret rituals. What happened inside the telesterion remains one of history's best-kept secrets. The vow of silence was so absolute that despite thousands upon thousands of people being initiated over 2 millennia, despite the mysteries being perhaps the most important religious experience in the ancient Mediterranean world, we have no clear account of what the initiates actually witnessed. Those who were initiated never spoke of it. Those who weren't initiated never knew. But we can piece together hints from various sources. The ancient philosopher Aristotle, who was himself initiated, said that initiates did not learn anything new, meaning they weren't taught secret knowledge or doctrine, but rather experienced something, and through that experience were transformed. He described the mysteries as working through 3 elements: things enacted, dramana; things shown, deinamena; and things said, legomena. Some kind of sacred drama was performed, certain holy objects were revealed, and particular sacred words or formulas were spoken. The Ninian tablet, a marble relief found at Eleusis and now housed in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, provides rare visual evidence of the mysteries. It shows a procession of initiates being led by Iacchos toward Demeter and Persephone, who wait to receive them. The goddesses are depicted inside or near the telesterion, with Demeter seated on a sacred chest called a kista, and Persephone holding a torch. The initiates carry staffs topped with myrtle called bakoi and appear to be approaching the divine presence with reverence and awe. Scholars believe the secret rites involved a reenactment of Persephone's descent and return, her death and rebirth, possibly with priestesses playing the roles of Demeter and Persephone. At some climactic moment, described in later Christian sources that tried to discredit the mysteries as pagan superstition, the high priest, the Hierophant, would strike a gong and announce a divine birth, or display an ear of grain that had been cut, showing how from the dead seed came new life. This symbolism of the grain would have been immediately understood by an agricultural society. The seed that is planted looks dead, sits in darkness beneath the earth like Persephone in the underworld, but does not truly die. It transforms, sending down roots and then sending up shoots, bursting through the soil as new life, exactly as Persephone returns from the underworld to bring spring. The cycle is eternal, death always leading to rebirth, darkness always yielding to light. The emotional and spiritual impact on initiates was profound. Ancient sources consistently describe the mysteries as life-changing. The poet Sophocles wrote, "Thrice blessed are those mortals who, having seen these rites, go down to Hades. Only for them is there life there. For others, all is misery." The philosopher Cicero said, "We have learned from them the beginnings of life, and have gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope." The mysteries promised initiates that death was not the end, that some part of them would continue, that they need not fear the gray eternity in the underworld because they had been transformed, had undergone a symbolic death and rebirth in the initiation, had been shown the path Persephone walked. They learned that just as grain dies and is reborn, just as Persephone descends and rises, so too would they experience transformation beyond death rather than simple extinction. This promise made the Eleusinian mysteries incredibly popular throughout the ancient world. As Greek culture spread through Alexander's conquests and later through Roman imperial expansion, the mysteries spread with it. Initiates came from Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Rome itself. The Roman emperors Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, and others made the pilgrimage to Eleusis. The mystery religions, as they came to be called, offered something public Greek religion did not: a personal relationship with the divine, a transformation of the individual soul, and most importantly, hope in the face of mortality. The mysteries survived for nearly 2,000 years, outlasting the rise and fall of city-states, the conquests of Alexander, the Roman Republic, and empire, enduring until Christianity, with its own promises of life after death and its own secret rites, finally displaced the older religion. In 392 CE, the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius banned all pagan worship, including the Eleusinian mysteries. 4 years later, the sanctuary at Eleusis was destroyed by invading Visigoths, bringing the ancient tradition to a violent end. With the mysteries went their secrets, carried by the initiates to their graves, never written down, never revealed, preserved through oral tradition and experiential knowledge that died when the last initiated elders passed away. What exactly the ancient Greeks experienced in that great hall, what they saw when the Anacteron was opened, what words were spoken, what transformation occurred, we will likely never know with certainty. But we know what it meant to them. We know it changed how they viewed death, gave them courage and hope, connected them to something greater than themselves. And we know it was founded on the myth of Persephone, the goddess who had gone into darkness and returned, who had died to the world above and been reborn to it, who showed that the cycle could be endured, that winter always gives way to spring, that from death comes life, eternally, inevitably, like seeds planted in darkness that must eventually sprout. The cycle continues, seasons of the soul. The myth of Persephone and Hades is, at its most fundamental level, an etiological tale, a story created to explain a natural phenomenon that ancient peoples observed but could not scientifically explain. Why do the seasons change? Why does the fertile earth that gives us crops in spring and summer turn cold and barren in autumn and winter? Why must death come to the plant world every year, only to be followed by resurrection and renewal? The ancient Greeks answered these questions through Persephone's story. When she descended to the underworld to spend 4 months, or 6 depending on the version, with Hades, her mother Demeter's grief returned. The goddess of agriculture withdrew her blessing from the earth, and nothing would grow during her daughter's absence. The land became barren. Cold descended. Leaves fell from trees, and the world entered a period of death and dormancy. This was winter, explained not through atmospheric science or axial tilt, but through a mother's sorrow. When Persephone returned to the surface world, ascending from the darkness like a seed sprouting, Demeter's joy manifested as spring. The earth came back to life. Flowers bloomed, trees budded, crops sprouted, and warmth returned to the land. Summer followed, with its abundance and harvest, but always with the knowledge that eventually Persephone would have to descend again. The cycle would continue. Winter would return. Nothing about this was permanent. Everything was in flux, death and rebirth following each other as regularly as day and night. For an agricultural society like ancient Greece, this myth carried profound practical meaning. Farmers lived by the seasons, understood implicitly that they were governed by forces beyond human control, that the fertility of the land was a gift that could be withdrawn, that survival depended on respecting the cycles of death and rebirth. Planting season required faith that the seeds they buried in the earth, seeds that looked dead and inert, would somehow come back to life, would push through soil and stone to reach sunlight. Persephone's journey mirrored that of the seed. She descended into darkness, spent months in a place where nothing grew and no light reached, then returned to bring life and growth with her. The seed went into the dark earth, spent months buried and dormant, then sprouted and grew toward the sun. Both underwent a kind of death, a transformation in darkness and a resurrection into light. Neither process could be rushed or avoided. Both required the descent into darkness before the return to light was possible. But the myth operated on levels beyond the merely agricultural. It also spoke to the human experience of loss and return, separation and reunion, detha, and continuity. Every parent who has been separated from a child, every child who has lost a parent, every person who has experienced grief could see themselves in Demeter and Persephone's story. The myth acknowledged that such losses are devastating, that the world can seem to end when someone you love is taken from you, that grief is a legitimate response to violation, and loss. But it also suggested that even the most terrible losses are not necessarily permanent, that reunion is possible even after death seems to have claimed what you love. Persephone does return to Demeter annually, reliably, as certain as spring follows winter. Their separation is real and painful, but it is not absolute or final. They maintain their bond across the boundary between worlds, maintain their relationship despite the violation that tried to sever it. The myth also speaks to transformation, to how we are changed by trauma and loss, by the descents we must make, whether we choose them or not. Persephone does not return from the underworld unchanged. She is no longer simply Kor the maiden. She has become Persephone the queen, has gained knowledge and power in a maturity that innocence never provides. The girl who picked flowers becomes the woman who rules over the dead. The maiden protected by her mother becomes the goddess who needs no protection, who is herself powerful and terrible. This transformation, forced upon her through violation, nevertheless becomes hers. She claims the power that her abduction paradoxically granted her. She becomes sovereign over death, guide of souls, dispenser of justice in the afterlife. She transforms from victim into agent, from object of male desire and divine conspiracy, into a subject who makes her own decisions, wields her own authority, commands her own respect. Many feminist readings of the myth focus on this transformation, seeing in Persephone a model of how women can reclaim agency, even from situations where it has been violently stripped away. They point out that while we cannot condone or romanticize the abduction, we can acknowledge Persephone's adaptation and survival, her refusal to remain simply a victim, her claiming of power within the constraints forced upon her. Other interpreters focus on the mother-daughter relationship at the heart of the myth, the bond between Demeter and Persephone that proves strong enough to challenge Zeus himself, to bring the world to the brink of destruction, to force compromise from the king of the gods. Demeter's love for her daughter, expressed through her grief and rage, and the leverage she wielded through her control of agriculture, demonstrates a form of power that existed outside the traditional masculine hierarchy of Olympus. Demeter was not a warrior goddess like Athena, who could challenge with strategy and combat. She was not a queen like Hera, who could scheme and punish and maintain her position through cunning. She was a mother, and her power came from that relationship, from her willingness to let the world starve rather than accept her daughter's loss, from her understanding that Zeus's power as king of the gods meant nothing if humanity perished and took divine worship with them. The myth thus presents a complex portrait of female power operating in multiple registers simultaneously. Persephone gains power through her transformation from maiden to queen, through her mastery of the underworld and her role in the mysteries of death and rebirth. Demeter wields power through her maternal grief, through her refusal to participate in the divine order when that order violates the bond with her daughter, through her willingness to destroy rather than accept injustice. The cycles the myth establishes, both agricultural and emotional, also reflect the Greek understanding of time itself. Unlike later Christian linear time, with its movement from creation through redemption toward final judgment, Greek time was cyclical, The seasons turned, generations succeeded each other. Even the ages of the world progressed through recurring patterns. There was no escaping these cycles, no progression towards some ultimate resolution. There was only the eternal return, the repeated pattern of descent and ascent, death and rebirth, separation and reunion. This cyclical understanding appears throughout Greek thought and culture. The festival year repeated annually. The Olympic Games recurred every 4 years. Heroes were honored at regular intervals. The dead were remembered through cyclical rites and offerings. Even the Eleusinian mysteries, initiated every autumn, participated in this pattern of recurring sacred time. Persephone's annual descent and return embodied this cyclical understanding perfectly. Each year she would go down into darkness. Each year her mother would grieve. Each year she would return, bringing spring with her. The pattern was eternal, unchanging even as it involved change, constant even in its transformation. There was comfort in this for the ancient Greeks, a sense that even death and loss were part of a larger pattern that would continue, that spring would always follow winter, no matter how terrible the cold. But there was also something tragic in it, a recognition that resolution was impossible, that Persephone would never be fully restored to her mother, that Demeter would never be free of her grief, that the violation could never be undone. The compromise Zeus brokered was the best possible outcome, but it was still a compromise, still a wound that would never fully heal, still a separation that would recur eternally. Neither goddess got what she wanted. Both had to accept less than justice demanded. And so would humans, living in a world where justice was imperfect, where violations could not always be punished or repaired, where you learn to live with grief and loss because no other option existed. Modern retellings and reinterpretations of the myth have taken it in many directions, some honoring these ancient complexities, others simplifying or transforming them to serve contemporary concerns and sensibilities. Understanding how the myth has evolved in modern times reveals as much about our own culture as the ancient versions revealed about theirs. Modern interpretations, romanticizing the unromantic. In recent years, particularly in the 21st century, the myth of Persephone and Hades has experienced a remarkable revival and transformation in popular culture. From young adult novels to webcomics to the Tony-winning Broadway musical Hadestown, from retellings by authors like Madeline Miller and Rachel Smythe to casual references in television shows and social media posts, Persephone and Hades have become emblematic of a certain type of romance. The relationship between opposites, the dark god and the spring goddess, death and life learning to love each other. But this modern portrayal bears little resemblance to the ancient sources we have examined. In many contemporary retellings, Hades does not abduct Persephone. Instead, they meet, fall in love, and choose each other despite opposition from Demeter or the other gods. The pomegranate seeds are eaten willingly, even defiantly, as Persephone claims agency over her own fate and chooses to stay in the underworld at least part-time because she wants to be with Hades. In some versions, Hades is portrayed as misunderstood, lonely, and kind, while Demeter becomes overbearing and controlling, keeping her daughter isolated from the world. The story transforms from one about violation and forced marriage into one about a daughter's right to independence from her mother, with Hades as the means to that independence, rather than the violator of it. The abduction, if it appears at all, is softened into a misunderstanding, or reframed as Persephone going willingly and later claiming she was abducted to protect Hades from Zeus's wrath. This shift in portrayal reflects several contemporary cultural concerns and desires. Modern audiences are uncomfortable with the idea of a romance founded on abduction and rape. We have different understandings of consent than ancient Greeks did, different expectations for relationships, different ideas about what constitutes acceptable behavior in courtship and marriage. The ancient version of the myth, with its explicit violence and lack of consent, reads today as deeply problematic, a story about sexual assault and trafficking rather than romance. So modern retellings change it, soften it, make it palatable by removing the elements that make us uncomfortable. They create the Hades and Persephone relationship we wish existed in the myth, rather than the one that actually appears in ancient sources. This impulse is understandable. We want our myths to reflect our values, want our heroes and heroines to make choices we can support, want love stories that inspire rather than disturb us. But this sanitization comes at a cost. When we erase the violence from Persephone's story, we also erase the complexity of her transformation, the way she claimed power from powerlessness, built agency from its denial, became queen not through choice but through survival. The modern romantic Persephone who chooses Hades from the beginning is perhaps more comfortable, but she is also less interesting, less representative of the difficult, complex ways people actually survive trauma and make meaning from terrible experiences. Some scholars and writers have pushed back against both the ancient violence and the modern romanticization, seeking a middle ground that acknowledges the myth's problematic elements while still finding value in it. Feminist reinterpretations have emphasized Persephone's transformation into a powerful queen, her mastery of the underworld, her evolution from core to dread Persephone. These readings don't excuse or romanticize the abduction, but they do highlight how Persephone refused to remain simply a victim, how she adapted and grew and claimed authority within her circumstances. Other modern interpreters focus on Demeter rather than Persephone, seeing in the myth a powerful statement about maternal love and rage, about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child, about the power that exists in refusing to participate in systems that harm those you love. Demeter's willingness to let humanity starve rather than accept her daughter's loss becomes, in these readings, an act of resistance against patriarchal, divine authority, a refusal to accept that fathers have the right to give daughters to husbands without consent. The myth has also been read through psychological and spiritual lenses, as a metaphor for the journey from innocence to experience, from childhood to adulthood, from surface consciousness to deep unconscious. Persephone's descent into the underworld becomes the necessary journey into darkness that everyone must make, the confrontation with death and shadow that is required for psychological wholeness. Her return represents integration, bringing what you've learned in darkness back into the light, becoming whole by accepting both aspects of existence, rather than pretending life is only sunshine and flowers. The debate about how to interpret and represent the myth reflects broader cultural conversations about sexual violence, consent, agency, and how we tell stories about trauma. Should we sanitize disturbing myths to make them appropriate for modern audiences, or preserve their original forms, even when those forms include elements we now consider unacceptable? Is it possible to acknowledge that a myth contains problematic elements while still finding value in it? Can we separate a story's enduring themes from its culturally specific expressions of those themes? There are no easy answers to these questions. What we can say is that both the ancient and modern versions of the myth reveal something true about the cultures that told them. The ancient Greeks told a story about a maiden abducted, a mother who grieved, and a compromise that created the seasons because that reflected their understanding of power, marriage, divine justice, and the cycles of nature. Modern readers, uncomfortable with that violence, retell the story with consent and choice because those values are central to our understanding of legitimate relationships. Neither version is the true myth in any absolute sense. Myths exist to be retold, reinterpreted, reshaped to meet the needs of new audiences and new times. The story of Persephone and Hades has been changing since before the Homeric hymn was composed, evolving through Hesiod and Ovid and countless other retellings, through ancient art and modern comics, through scholarly analysis and popular adaptation. What remains constant across all these versions is the core structure. A goddess descends into darkness, is transformed by that descent, and returns changed. A mother grieves and rages and refuses to accept loss. The seasons turn because of these divine dramas, and humans caught in the middle learn to live with cycles of death and rebirth, separation and reunion, winter and spring. The specific details of consent and coercion, of romance and violation, may change with cultural values and storytelling needs, but the underlying patterns persist. Perhaps this persistence, this ability to be endlessly retold and reimagined while retaining recognizable core elements, is what makes the myth powerful across cultures and centuries. It speaks to experiences that remain relevant whether you live in ancient Athens or modern New York. The trauma of violation and loss, the complex bond between mothers and daughters, the cycles of death and rebirth that govern not just seasons, but lives, the possibility of transformation, even through terrible circumstances, the power that can be claimed even from powerlessness. The myth refuses easy categories, resists simple interpretation, contains contradictions that cannot be fully resolved. Persephone is both victim and queen, both innocent maiden and dread goddess, both core and Persephone, both daughter and wife, both spring and death. She exists in the liminal space between opposites, forever transitioning, forever changing, forever returning only to descend again. And perhaps that complex, contradictory, cyclical existence is what makes her story continue to resonate with generation after generation, each finding in it reflections of their own struggles with loss and transformation, darkness and renewal. The eternal return, legacy and meaning. As we reach the end of our journey through the myth of Persephone and Hades, let your breathing deepen. Let the weight of these ancient stories settle into your understanding like seeds settling into earth. We have traveled from sunlit meadows to the darkest halls of the underworld and back again. We have witnessed abduction and grief, transformation and power, the cycles that turn forever. bringing death and rebirth in eternal succession. But before we close, there is one final truth hidden in this myth that deserves revelation. One twist that recontextualizes everything we've explored tonight. It concerns the very name Persephone and what it might tell us about transformation, identity, and the deepest meaning of this ancient tale. The girl who was abducted was called Kor, simply the maiden. But the queen who returned was Persephone. Two different names for what ancient sources sometimes treated as two different goddesses, the spring maiden and the queen of the dead. Some scholars have interpreted this as evidence of an older tradition, one that predates the abduction narrative entirely, suggesting that Kor and Persephone may have originally been separate deities who were later merged into a single figure whose story explained that merger. What if the myth of abduction wasn't originally about a literal kidnapping at all, but rather an initiation? What if it was always meant to represent the transformation every person undergoes from innocence to experience, from childhood to adulthood, from ignorance of death to intimate knowledge of mortality? The girl must die for the woman to be born. Kor must descend into darkness for Persephone to emerge. Consider this interpretation carefully. The Eleusinian mysteries, which we explored earlier, were initiation rites. Initiates symbolically died and were reborn, descending into darkness and ascending into light, exactly as Persephone did. They drank the kykeon, possibly a psychoactive brew that dissolved their sense of self. They experienced visions and transformations in the darkness of the telesterion. They emerged changed, no longer who they had been when they entered, having undergone a death and rebirth that promised them the same beyond physical death. What if the entire myth was always meant to be understood this way? What if Persephone's story is not just about a specific goddess, but about every human soul, every person who must journey through darkness to reach maturity, who must lose innocence to gain wisdom, who must confront death to truly understand life? The abduction becomes the inevitable confrontation with mortality that we all must face. Demeter's grief becomes our grief for the innocence we lose. The pomegranate seeds become the irreversible knowledge of death that, once consumed, binds us to that awareness forever. This doesn't erase the violence in the myth or excuse the violation. The ancient versions still describe assault and coercion, and those elements matter. But it suggests that beneath the surface narrative, beneath even the aetiological explanation for seasons, the myth may contain an even deeper truth about human existence itself. We are all Korah before we confront mortality. We are all Persephone after. And here is where the myth reveals its final, devastating wisdom. You cannot go back. Once the seeds are eaten, once you've descended into that knowledge of death and darkness, you cannot return to pure innocence. Persephone spends 8 months above ground, yes, but she is no longer simply Kor. She brings spring, but she also carries winter within her. She knows both light and shadow. She rules both life and death. She is eternally divided, eternally transformed, eternally both maiden and queen. This is what makes the myth so powerful and so enduring. It tells us that transformation through darkness is not optional. Life will drag you into depths you didn't choose. Grief will find you. Loss will transform you. Death will touch everything you love. You will eat the pomegranate seeds, whether you want to or not, whether you understand their meaning or not, whether you consent or not. But the myth also tells us that transformation, even forced transformation, need not destroy us. Persephone claimed power in the underworld. She became a goddess feared and respected across the Greek world. She learned to rule the realm of death and to bring spring to the world of the living. She made meaning from violation, built identity from loss, transformed her captivity into sovereignty. Not because the violation was acceptable, it never was, but because she refused to remain simply a victim of it. The ancient Greeks, with this myth, acknowledged something that modern culture often tries to deny: that terrible things happen, that innocence is lost, that we are changed by trauma in ways we cannot control or reverse. But they also suggested that such changes, however forced upon us, become part of who we are. We can claim them, can build power from powerlessness, can become something new rather than remaining forever defined by what was done to us. What does this myth teach us? Across the millennia that separate us from its ancient tellers, what truths does it preserve that remain relevant even as cultures change and values shift? First, it teaches us about the cyclical nature of existence, about how death and life, loss and return, darkness and light follow each other as inevitably as seasons turn. The ancient Greeks understood something that modern cultures, with their emphasis on linear progress and permanent solutions, sometimes forget: that many of the most important patterns in life are not problems to be solved, but cycles to be endured and understood. Persephone's descent cannot be prevented. Winter will come, darkness will fall, loss will occur. But spring also returns. Light follows darkness. What descends can also rise. Second, it speaks to transformation, particularly the transformations forced upon us by trauma and violation. Persephone did not choose her abduction. She did not ask to become queen of the underworld. She was stolen, violated, trapped by pomegranate seeds and divine conspiracy. Yet within these constraints, she built a form of power, became one of the most feared and respected goddesses in the Greek pantheon, claimed authority over the realm of the dead and the mysteries of death and rebirth. Third, it reveals the strength of the bond between mother and daughter, the power of maternal love, even against divine authority. Demeter's grief shook Olympus and nearly destroyed humanity. Her refusal to accept her daughter's loss forced even Zeus to compromise. The myth suggests that some bonds transcend power hierarchies, that love can become leverage, that those who seem powerless may wield forms of power that the mighty cannot counter. Fourth, the myth addresses the permeability of boundaries that seem absolute. Persephone crosses regularly between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a journey that should be one way but becomes cyclical through the compromise Zeus decreed. She demonstrates that death is not the absolute end, that movement between worlds is possible, that the boundary between light and darkness, life and death, can be traversed. This theme, elaborated in the Eleusinian mysteries, offered hope to ancient initiates and continues to resonate with anyone who has lost someone they love and wishes to believe that connection persists beyond death's boundary. The pomegranate seeds remain one of the most powerful symbols in all of mythology. 6 tiny seeds, consumed in a moment, binding fate forever. They represent how small actions can have enormous consequences, how irreversible choices are sometimes made without full understanding of their implications, how we can be trapped by our own hungers and needs. But they also represent connection and continuity, the price paid to maintain relationships across impossible boundaries, the seeds from which new life grows even in darkness. For nearly 3,000 years, the story of Persephone and Hades has been told and retold, adapted and reinterpreted, used to explain seasons and to promise afterlife, to warn about consent and to celebrate transformation, to honor mother's love and to acknowledge daughters' journeys toward independence and self-knowledge. Based on the evidence of how this myth has functioned across cultures and centuries, we might infer that it has survived because it speaks to something essential about the human experience, something that transcends any particular culture or historical moment. We are all Persephone at times, stolen from our sunlit meadows by forces beyond our control, dragged into darkness we did not choose, forced to adapt to circumstances we never asked for. We are all Demeter at times, grieving losses we cannot accept, raging against violations we cannot prevent, trying to maintain bonds that the world conspires to sever. We are all bound by seeds we have eaten, choices we have made, or that have been forced upon us, patterns we cannot escape even when we understand them perfectly. But the myth also offers hope. Persephone does return to the surface every spring. The darkness is not permanent. Winter gives way to renewal. The dead grain sprouts. The daughter reunites with her mother. The cycles continue, bringing loss but also return, taking us down but also raising us up, ensuring that even the darkest descent is followed by ascent into light. As you drift towards sleep now, let the myth settle into your understanding, like those famous seeds settling into Persephone's stomach, binding her to the underworld, but also connecting her to power, making her queen of death and spring simultaneously. Neither fully light nor dark, but eternally both, forever descending and ascending, forever dying and being reborn. The story continues with each telling, each new generation finding in it meanings their ancestors might never have imagined, adding layers while preserving core patterns, making the myth new while keeping it ancient. Persephone still walks between worlds. Demeter still grieves and rejoices with the seasons. Hades still rules his dark kingdom. The pomegranate still bears its blood-red seeds. And we still tell the story, still find truth in it, still see ourselves reflected in these ancient divine dramas. Sleep now, and know that spring will come again, that what descends must rise, that even the longest winter eventually ends, that the seeds planted in darkness will eventually sprout toward light. The cycle continues, eternal and inevitable, death and rebirth, following each other forever, like Persephone journeying up and down, like seasons turning, like all things that end only to begin again, like every person who loses innocence and gains wisdom, who descends into darkness and emerges transformed, who is no longer who they were, but also more themselves than they've ever been. You are Core and Persephone both. You are the maiden and the queen. You contain multitudes, hold contradictions, walk between worlds. And perhaps that is the myth's final gift, the recognition that we are all divided, all transformed, all eternally becoming rather than simply being, all carrying both spring and winter within us, all powerful and powerless simultaneously, all victimized and sovereign, all bound and free, all dying and being reborn with every breath, every season, every story we tell ourselves about who we are and how we came to be this way. Good night, and thank you for joining me in exploring the dark romance of Persephone and Hades, the myth that refuses simple interpretation, that rewards deep examination, that speaks across millennia about loss and transformation, grief and power, darkness and spring. If you enjoyed this journey into the depths of Greek mythology, please consider subscribing to Sleepable Mythology for more explorations of ancient stories, and let me know in the comments which myth you'd like to hear next. May your dreams be filled with flowers and darkness, with descent and ascent, with the eternal cycle that governs all existence. May you find power in powerlessness, hope in darkness, and may you always remember that spring follows winter, that light follows shadow, that return follows departure eternally and inevitably, like pomegranate seeds binding fate, like goddesses walking between worlds, like myths that never truly end but only transform, continuing their cycle of death and rebirth with each new telling, with each new dreamer, with each person who hears the name Persephone and recognizes somewhere deep within themselves the girl who became a queen, the maiden who learned to rule death, the spring that learned to carry winter, the innocent who descended and the powerful who rose. Rest well, transform, descend and rise. You are more than what was done to you. You are the seeds and the spring both. You are Persephone, eternal and changing, powerful and vulnerable, descending and ascending, forever and always, in every season of your soul.